Welcome. Welcome to Abolition, Democracy 713. In the winter and spring of 1973, the philosopher and social critic Michel Foucault delivered a series of lectures at the Collège de France in Paris on what he called La Société Punitive, the punitive society. He described there the birth of a disciplinary society at the end of the 18th century in France, one that had a unique logic. By contrast to logics of banishment in ancient Greek societies, by contrast to redemption and compensation in Germanic societies or societies that marked the body at the end of the Middle Ages, French 19th century society had gravitated towards a system of disciplining and confining its people. But not just anyone. Foucault tied that confinement to the political economic needs of industrialized capitalist society. The lectures were prescient insofar as they coincided exactly at that time in 1973 in this country with the unleashing of confinement on a massive scale, targeting the most vulnerable and marginalized in this country, poor, young, African-American and Latinx men and women. As you can see from this chart, the lectures coincided with a massive confinement that began at exactly that time in 1973 and would become an exponential increase in the number of persons incarcerated behind bars in state and federal prisons, and even more as well in jails across the country. Our society is today a punitive society. Of that, there is no doubt. We have the greatest number in raw numbers and rate of persons confined in cages than any country now or at any time in human history. And not just confinement, but strings of executions, like we've seen recently, the federal executions, fines and fees, solitary confinement. The punitive society permeates every aspect of our lives in this country. This presents, though, a challenge, a real challenge to abolition, because it means that we need to not simply abolish an institution or a practice, but a society, a way of living. W.E. Du Bois he understood that well. It was reflected in his magisterial book, Black Reconstruction in America. The central problem of racial injustice for Du Bois is not limited to any particular institution, right? But it goes through all of society. And at the heart of the problem is the criminal law and the role of the criminal law as justifying and naturalizing these distinctions that result in racial injustice. That's the question that we're going to address today. Not just the abolition of capital punishment or of prisons or of racial injustice, but the abolition of a punitive society that makes those possible. And I'm delighted that our seminar today is co-hosted by the Center for Research in Post-Kantian European Philosophy at the University of Warwick. I'm thrilled to have Daniele Lorenzini as my co-host. Daniele, please join me. Daniele has been a fellow here, at Columbia at the CCCCT for several years and is now a professor of philosophy and deputy director of the Center for Research in Post-Kantian European Philosophy at the University of Warwick. Daniele specializes in 20th century French philosophy, moral and political philosophy, and ordinary language philosophy. He's published widely, and he's edited many lectures and other writings by Michel Foucault, including, and his own work as well, including two monographs in French, Éthique et politique de soi from 2015 and La force du vrai in 2017. He's an editor of the journal Foucault Studies, and he's currently completing a monograph in English on Foucault's genealogy of truth and truth-telling. So I'm delighted that you are joining us, Daniele. Thank you. Tell us a little bit quickly before we go any further on the Center for Post-Kantian European Philosophy, what you mean by Post-Kantian and how that relates to praxis.
Thanks. Well, thank you so much, Bernard, for for having me. Many thanks also to all of our panelists today. I'm really delighted to co-host this seminar on Foucault and the Punitive Society, and to welcome so many colleagues and friends from Warwick. So the Center for Research in Post-Kantian European Philosophy was created in 2019 at Warwick as a kind of space, a forum for discussion and research in 19th and 20th century European philosophy, which has traditionally been one of the strengths of the Warwick Philosophy Department. So we organize seminars, workshops, conferences. We try to kind of provide a stimulating research environment, not only for faculty, but also for our students. But the center, and we see this today as well, has also the ambition to foster interdisciplinary research with scholars across the humanities and social sciences. And I'm particularly happy that our panelists today, that I will introduce later, are based in 4 different departments at Warwick: philosophy, sociology, politics, and law. This is kind of a nice example of the kind of approach that we want to have. And, you know, in terms of what we mean by post-Kantian philosophy, there's a basic kind of standard answer, which is, you know, the continental philosophical tradition that comes after Kant and develops in the wake of his work as a response of his work and as a critique of his work. So let's say from German idealism to French post-structuralism and deconstruction, including, of course, Marx, Nietzsche, existentialism, phenomenology, critical theory, etc. But there will be another answer. I mean, I would say a Foucauldian answer would be that post-Kantian European philosophy has to do with a kind of multiplicity of philosophical perspectives that in the past 2 centuries have situated themselves within the critical tradition inaugurated by Kant. And critical not only in the sense of the analysis of the conditions under which the subject can hope to acquire knowledge of a given object, but critical also, I think, in the sense of what Foucault calls a critical ontology of ourselves, meaning that philosophy, post-Kantian philosophy in particular, has the ambition both to explore the limits that are imposed on us, on what we think, what we do, what we are, and also to experiment with the possibility of transgressing those limits and transforming what we think, what we do, what we are, and our society. And that's precisely, you know, like the link to critical practice that this tradition has.
Right. Right. And I think we'll be talking about that a lot today, because we'll be thinking about diagnosing the punitive society, but also how to get beyond it, which is precisely the link you're talking about towards critical praxis. Quickly, let me just welcome, though, we have from Warwick, we have an extraordinary team of thinkers. Please join us all. Miguel Beistegui, it's wonderful to see you. Enrique Carvalho, Stuart, Elden, Goldie, Osuri, Irene Del Poz, and Federico Testa. It's great to have you all with us. It's an amazing group, an amazing team at Warwick. And as well, we have for our opening discussion and throughout, we will be in engagement with 2 remarkable thinkers and actors, Adnan Khan and Cori Thomas. And beyond that, of course, we'll also be in conversation with Fonda Shen, who runs the CCCCT, and Lonnie Morris, who I'll introduce in a moment. Now, what we are going to do as kind of a roadmap for the seminar today is we're going to have an opening panel where we will talk with Cori Thomas and Adnan Khan about a project that Cori and Adnan and others have been involved with, a play that Cori wrote called Lockdown, a magnificent play, an important play. And that involves someone who can't join us in person, Lonnie Morris because he's incarcerated at San Quentin, and he's been there for now 43 years. Thanks, Fonda, for joining us. You've been helping prepare this panel, and talking with Cori and Adnan, of course, and you also started to talk with Lonnie Morris. But actually, before I get to that, let me just quickly introduce Adnan Khan and Cori Thomas, which I didn't do properly. Sorry. So Adnan, hi, good to see you. Welcome back. Is the executive director and co-founder of Restore Justice, which he co-founded while he was incarcerated. Adnan Khan was sentenced to 25 years to life under the felony murder rule when he was only 18 years old. And while in prison, he inspired, launched, and worked on legislation in California, Senate Bill 1437, that tried to get rid of the felony rule. The bill passed, and after serving 16 years, including a lot of time at San Quentin, where the play takes place. In January 2019, Adnan was the first person resentenced under the bill that he helped create. And in addition, during his incarceration, he also created First Watch, a media filmmaking project produced entirely by incarcerated men at San Quentin State Prison that still produces short films today. And we put one of those films, Adnan, that you made while you were in San Quentin on the Parole Process on the blog. So if you look on the right in the posts, there's a link to that really remarkable short film that you made, Adnan. Today, Adnan continues his advocacy work nationally as well as internationally. And Cori Thomas is an award-winning playwright and screenwriter who most recently wrote and produced the play Lockdown that is at the source of this conversation. She's won the American Theater Critics Osborne Award and is the Andrew Mellon Playwright in Residence at WP Theater. And Cori is presently co-writing the memoirs of sex trafficking survivor Sarah Cruzan for Knopf Random House. So we can't wait to read that. She continues to volunteer at San Quentin State Prison with the anti-violence program No More Tears and serves on its board. Now, we were going to show a segment from the play, but we had difficulties with the rights. And instead what happened was a conversation really between Cori and Fonda and Lonnie Morris, who is incarcerated at San Quentin and who is at the heart of Cori's play. And I thought it would be good to actually start with Lonnie's voice, and because we want to ground our seminar, we want to ground our work, we want to ground our praxis in the lived experience itself. And so Fonda, you had some interviews. You want to tell us a little bit about that, and then why don't you go ahead and play the interview with Lonnie Morris? Tell us about it first.
Yeah, sure. So as Bernard was saying, we had been talking about Cori's amazing play Lockdown, and during our conversations, my conversations with Cori, she kept bringing up Lonnie Morris, my friend Lonnie at San Quentin, and she told me about how he was central to the writing of her play and about how he was mentoring all these young men at San Quentin. He would sound like the most remarkable person. And at the same time, Cori had been telling Lonnie about our little project here. And of course, Lonnie was so interested to hear that there's this seminar on abolitionism going on. And so one day Cori asked, she said, would you be open to talking to Lonnie? He has some questions about the project. And I said, sure, of course. And then he grilled me for about 20 minutes on abolitionism on the phone. And I answered a lot of questions that I had no business answering. It was great. And so we started these amazing conversations, and he's just warm and funny and brilliant. And one of the first things that Cori told me was that he had been before the California Board of Pardons and Paroles 20 times and had been denied every single time over the course of 43 years. And so I've been lucky enough to talk with him many times over the past few weeks, and I'm really lucky that I get to share part of that with you today.
Thank you, Fonda. Thanks for all your work. You do so much volunteering as well at Rikers and elsewhere. Thanks. So, do you want to play the segment, and then after that we'll bring in Cori and Adnan.
Yeah, it'd be great if everyone turned their cameras off, I think.
Okay, we'll do that. Thanks.
You know, she wanted to kind of do one about somebody on death row. And I said, well, you know, that's cool. I said, but you know, that seems like everybody wants to do something about somebody on death row. I said, they got people that's on death row and they on death row, like me. We're doing a lot of sentences, been in prison forever. And, you know, we don't know if we're ever going to get out. We could have a death and we could die in here. So I don't know what nobody don't want to do a play about that, you know. And so she said, oh, well, you know, let me kind of think about that. You know, that's interesting. And we had this ongoing conversation. And then she would, I guess, talk with her people and came with the idea of doing lockdown, you know. And so then I started really working with her to give her some context so that she could understand things in an authentic way, as opposed to what you see in a lot of prison-related movies or plays or what have you, right? You know, there's always emphasis on the violence and the drugs and the sex in prison and all this other stuff, you know. And I was telling her that that prison is really, there's a lot of mundaneness to prison, and some of the most difficult things to get through in prison. Certainly there's violence in prison, certainly there's other difficulties, but one of the most difficult things is the monotony of the prison and the loneliness of prison. You know, the fact that when you go to your cell at night, you locked in. And then for those of us who are doing life, the reality that we may never get out of prison. Well, just simple language, the prison language, you know what I'm saying? You know, how we frame terminology, what terms mean, you know, that. And then the nuances of interacting with officers, right? And the do's and don'ts, right? Of the prison environment. You know, there's certain guidelines, like, you know, hey, you don't walk certain places, you know. Like, if a visitor's there, just showing them how, I don't know, we can't take too close because somebody's going to think we up to something. You know, don't ever hand me nothing in a closed hand kind of thing. You know, simple things like that, because if you close your hand, you hand a person something, and an officer sees it, they think you handed something illegal, right? So it's just a lot of the nuances of that, of this environment. And then, like I say, language was really big, because she just said she was trying to write some stuff and she didn't have no idea about the nomenclature or the culture of prison. So some of the terminology, like, what is that? Nobody don't talk like that. That you've been locked in a room for a lot of years, right? And then somebody comes by and they unlock the door, and you hear them unlock the door, but you don't know whether there's another lock on the door. So you're really hesitant to get up and go, you know, test the door to see if it'll open, because you're concerned that if when you test it, it doesn't, because there's another lock on there, and then that'd be kind of like really devastating to you. So you kind of just sitting there waiting to see if they'll come and actually open the door. You know what I'm saying? And say, okay, man, you can come out now, kind of thing, right? So it's kind of like that. You know, that's the best kind of way I can describe it. And that all the hard work and, you know, effort that myself, a lawyer, you know, and all the people that support me, and have been supporting me for years, all this, you know, effort we put into this has finally borne some fruit. And it also, the most important thing was, it felt like board that saw me for the first time, for the person I am. Because that's always kind of hurt me a lot, was that, you know, you don't see me. You know, I know you see the record, you got all the stuff in the record, and, you know, all the case files, and you got the letters, and you got for me, against me, and you got the people talking, and, you know, everybody's got their own.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And so everybody's, you know, giving you this version of Lonnie, you know, those who are for me, those who are against me. I'm a liar to some people. I'm a violent person. I'm a, you know, the greatest person in the world. You know, of all these things to different people, right? And you're looking at all this stuff, but I'm right here. I'm sitting right here. You know what I'm saying? And I'm hoping you can actually see me, you know, for who I am right now. You know, and so that felt like, for the first time in all these years, they finally saw me. You know.
Thank you, Fonda, for all those conversations and for compiling that for us and for bringing us into this conversation with Lonnie Morris. Cori and Adnan, of course, you've known Lonnie for a long time. You know what a person he is, who he is, right, Cori? You've worked with him, so it's very moving that as this process has evolved and as we've been planning this, that finally he's been favorably, that the board has made a favorable review, right? How are you processing all this, Cori, now, and what's it been like to work with Lonnie?
It's really been the most amazing experience. I teared up hearing his voice at the beginning of the presentation and seeing his face, because I was just, you know, sorry, it makes me feel so emotional. I just imagine how much he would love to be part of this, you know, really, but it's so wonderful that he's part of it virtually. You know, that was beautiful. So the day of his hearing, I was just on pins and needles, and I actually heard the news from Adnan first. He texted me. I mean, there's always this kind of like, you know, this little network of people who all know each other. There were people like texting me, have you heard anything yet? Have you heard anything yet? And I hadn't heard anything because I know these things last hours. I was in the middle of rehearsal for lockdown, the last hearing he had, which was 2019 in April. I flew for 2 days during rehearsal to be there because I'd actually worked with him a little bit. I got his old parole hearing transcripts that he had, and I asked him the questions, and I'd say, you know, because he's done it so many times, I said, it sounds almost like you've memorized your answers at this point, you know, because he knows the stuff better than the people asking the questions at this point. So I was like, you just have to it doesn't have to sound so right, just sound honest. So if he sounded like canned, I'd say, do it again. So anyway, this morning I was just sitting there, you know, that day for 5 hours waiting for him to come back from his board hearing. And he came back and he had a look on his face and he'd gotten a split decision, which was the first time ever in his life he got a split decision. Then it went to an en banc hearing that we all were at, Adnan. A lot of us went there to be supportive in person for that, and they denied him again. So it was just so crushed, and I felt how crushed he was, because I think it was the first time he'd had hope that time when he got that split decision. So this time around, it was just, I felt in my heart that this was like a really important one, that if he didn't get it, it might crush his soul at this point. You know, he's 69 years old. There was a whole issue a few weeks ago where they were planning to transfer him to another prison. And a bunch of us wrote letters because we're like, this is the only home this man is known for so many years. He's a mentor to so many young men there. It's cruel, actually. And he's preparing for a board hearing, which is stressful in itself. So it was just one of those like really, really epic kind of like suspenseful board hearings, I think. And Adnan texted me and said, I hear a little rumor that he was found suitable. And I was like, I'm not going to get excited about it till I hear. So it wasn't until Lonnie's lawyer, Lily, texted me that he was found suitable that I was like, phew. You know, I mean, I think I cried, I screamed, I jumped. It was like the most amazing thing, really. And then he called, you know, a few hours later and confirmed it. So it's just been wonderful.
Thanks, Cori. And everyone should read. Cori has posted an amazing essay on our blog about the experience of working with Lonnie and about the experience of writing Lockdown. And everybody, you've got to read this essay. And you also look at Adnan video, which explains the parole process, because the parole process is at the heart of this disciplinary society that we're studying. Adnan, tell us a little bit, turn on your mic and tell us a little bit about this parole process and how you are experiencing, and also Lonnie Morris's, the decision that he's favorable, which I take it goes to the governor, right?
Well, yeah. So my understanding of the parole process is the parole board and the system in itself is very arbitrary. You know, if you can't speak their language, sound like a robot, it is very unlikely that you'll be found suitable. I think right now in California we have an 84% denial rate. I'm not sure if that's the exact number, 84, but I know it's above 80% denial rate. If you look before Governor Brown, which in California, which was in 2010/2011 when he officially took office, 30 years prior to that governor, 98% of people were being found, were not being found suitable by the board, meaning they were being denied. 30 years, and that's where Lonnie fits in. And Lonnie, he committed that act in 1977. And was sentenced to 7 years to life, which means after 7 years in 1984, he appeared before the parole board. And they kept denying him, and they kept denying him, and they kept denying him 20 other times up until 40 plus years. So over 35 years, no disciplinary write-up, no violence, nothing like that. And Lonnie is an example of many. We call them the 7 to lifers, the 7 and ups. Right, like people who were stuck with the 7 to life sentence and are still in prison. So with the parole system, it's like they'll if you don't have a parole representative, if you don't have a proper attorney, if you don't say the right things, you know, a lot of times, Cori, you can also say that parole board have found people, have denied people before they even stepped in the room. And that's like a culture you hear all the time, right? Like they already had me denied before I got in there. Some people get walked through. It's a very easier process. You know, they get walked through the process and you're free. But I will say that Lonnie, so last time Lonnie, when he went to the parole board before this time where he was found suitable, there was a split decision. I will also mention who sits on the parole board, who's in charge of saying that you're safe for society. It's dominated by former law enforcement, former prosecutors turned judges who are now parole board commissioners, former wardens of prisons, right? Those are the people in charge, and they're supposed to have this non-biased idea about safety. So that's where the arbitrariness comes in. I will also mention, and I think this is in the bio, with Lonnie in particular, this has to be named. Lonnie, sadly, he in 1977, he killed a police officer in the commission of a robbery. And that's the only reason he's still in prison. He was just found suitable a week ago. So when you asked that question, Bernard, to Cori, like, how did you feel? As soon as I heard and it was confirmed, my excitement was quickly eclipsed by fear, because I know the next step is the governor. The governor's office and Gavin Newsom has been horrific at taking people's dates once the parole board has already found them suitable and quote unquote safe for release. So the governor himself has vetoed those decisions by his own parole board. And because this is political, and because our governor in California, he has been, you know, vetoing bills, sending incarcerated firefighters to the federal ICE, you know, notifying federal ICE agents to pick them up, incarcerated firefighters, sending just vetoing bills on phone calls. to cheapen phone calls or lessen the expenses of phone calls in prisons and jails. All sorts of things that he's been very horrific on. And then obviously the pandemic response. That's where my fear of Lonnie's comes up. I'm going to pause there. I have a lot of thoughts around a lot of this stuff, especially punitive society, but I'll just pause there.
Yeah, yeah. And you have to, and we have to put this in the context of a governor who put a moratorium on the death penalty, right? You know what I mean? So who is viewed by many around the country and many abolitionists as someone who is, relatively enlightened, right? And yet, as you explained, these are the intricate ways in which kind of the punitive society plays out, right? That there can be these aspects of it that might kind of change, but others that don't, or allowing that kind of ICE detention of someone who's coming off of a site working on the fires, right?
I think it's a lot of times it's easy to see the people's political aspirations, and so some of the decisions, or many of the decisions that are made, have been inconsistent, at least with this governor, right? And so I believe, we talk about abolition, many people talk about reform, and public officials technically are there because, or elected officials are there because the public opinion, many times, not all the time, can sometimes sway people's decisions. But when it comes to what we're seeing, at least with this governor, I believe, and we talked about this the other day, Bernard, was, it's not even quote unquote criminal justice reform, it's criminal justice conform. And I think what's happening is it's the other way around. Instead of the public having influence on our elected officials, it's more like the elected officials see the pushback from the public and take pieces and not even reform, but flip it to conform some of those ideas to still the establishment's ways and what they want to continue doing. And so a lot of us can sometimes, sadly,
explain that idea of conform again.
So the idea of what I believe the idea of conforming is reforming would be changing something and just making it better and changing it within the system, right? Abolition obviously is creating something brand new. Conforming is coming from the establishment themselves. So whatever's already set up, when there's pushback on the establishment and there's momentum growing from the people to push back against the establishment, I believe that what happens is there's pieces of comfort fed to the public to say, hey, we're going to listen to you. So I'm going to put a moratorium on the death penalty, but I'm not going to really push to end the death penalty, or I'm not going to actually commute their sentences. But I'm going to give this to you. I'm going to put a moratorium, and I'm going to hail it as something heroic. And this is more. And Foucault talks about it in Punitive Society about morality, how they use morality to speak to the public to continue doing whatever they're doing. The truth is, Newsom can commute every 750 some odd people that are on California's death row to whatever sentence he chooses to commute them to. But he kept them on death row and just put a moratorium on killing them. Right, we're not going to kill you. So I'll give you a quick final example. I don't want to take up the. Oh, go ahead.
The exception of a few, I think, that requires Supreme Court action from California, right? Isn't there a? But go ahead.
Compared to the power that he has as a governor, it's I believe it's very non-existent. He hasn't commuted sentence. He's been horrible. I will also say that another bill that just passed, there was a lot of attention on California's wildfires during the summer and at the beginning of the fall. A lot of attention, particularly for incarcerated firefighters. So yes, he sent some to notified ICE. There was an incident where a gentleman, he was incarcerated firefighter, a piece of a tree fell on his leg, almost died. He was airlifted out of the scene. He was taken to the hospital, then immediately taken to solitary confinement because of COVID. And then the day that he's about to be released in about a week or two, he calls his family. In the meantime, his sister, hey, I'm about to get released. It's okay. I don't care. They put me in solitary. I'm just going to get released, and I'll see you soon. The day he was to be released, his family was in front of the prison gate. And next thing you know, ICE federal agents, and mind you, this is state prison, state government. There's nothing legally binding saying that our state has to contact Trump's federal government to pick up state incarcerated people. And so he did that. He sent them to ICE. But around that time, there was in the legislature a bill to allow expungements for incarcerated or formerly incarcerated firefighters to get their records expunged, so then they could become firefighters. And the way our governor and the quote unquote establishment publicly put that out there was, hey, look, firefighters, he even signed the bill in like everywhere. There was like desecration behind him, right? The trees were burnt, the place was burnt, and he sat on a bench and he signed that bill that I'm going to sign this bill to let formerly incarcerated firefighters get their records expunged. But when you look at the details of it, that's not in the public, that once people get out, they can't sign up to be firefighters. They have to file to a judge, the district attorney. They have to notify the district attorney so they can most likely reject it. They have to notify, in Cal Fire in California, the police fire chiefs have been against this bill. The union, And so it still hurdles. Then it gets to the judge, and then the judge decides. So during that time, the year, 2 years, or whatever it takes for this person's case to be eventually heard, what will they do? Right? What will they do? So my point is with the conforming, and I'm sorry for being long-winded. I get really passionate about this and frustrated, but the point is that a conformity is giving us, the public, the government or the establishment, seeing the momentum, the legit momentum, giving us just enough to pacify us, to kill the momentum. And that's a tactic that's consistently been used.
And that's really interesting. That goes back to Gayatri Spivak in our second meeting, who was writing precisely about that. The hurdles of abolitionism in part are kind of getting a small bone that then kind of takes the wind out of the sail. Cori, this notion of conforming is not only conforming in terms of getting people on the outside to satisfy them in a certain way, but I take it there's also an enormous amount of conforming going on in the prison itself. Was that your experience inside working with Lonnie and others?
Absolutely. There's so many rules. There's so many people watching at all times, and so you have to really play a sort of game to be able to do what it is that you need to do. Adnan would know very well also. And there's a certain, one of the reasons that I wrote the play actually was something that he said. I think I told him this one time. He actually was able to come to New York and see the play, which was like one of the greatest experiences of my life, because, when I met him, he was incarcerated and had no idea he was actually going to be out. And then when the play was produced, he had just been out like 4 months and was able to come to New York and see it. And we did a talk back. And I told him, I think for the first time, that one of the things that had inspired me was that he had said one time, he said, I wish people on the outside saw us as individuals. And that thing just became my mantra. That was really why I wrote the play, because then I kind of used Lonnie and other people that I sort of like put in a blender and, made this sort of composite character. But it was just to try to, if you can see an incarcerated person as a person, because I think, and I'm trying to get back to this idea of conformity. I think that when we think of people who are incarcerated, we just sort of see this sea of people dressed in blue. You don't see individual people. You don't think of people as individuals. And, and so and the parole board, for instance, is all about conforming to some sort of idea that has been decided upon by this group of people that Adnan says who really have very little business deciding if someone is suitable to rejoin society and has changed, because if their whole training is to look for the bad in people and to dig out the bad, how are you going to be able to see any good and see change? So it's all such a complicated, weird, messed up system that needs an overhaul to begin with, all around. So I think everything is sort of about conforming in a for or an against, pro and con conforming,
right.
In either way it's conforming.
And two things that strike me really is the parallel with what Lonnie was saying at the end, just what he just was saying to Fonda at the end, right? Being seen for who I am, right? Which is precisely what you're your play was about, and what is not there. And then this other aspect of conforming. I mean, what Lonnie Morris was talking about in terms of like, you don't shake hands, you don't give a full hand when you're in all these unwritten rules, like the existence. I mean, we have many of these on the outside as well, right? But the consequences are just kind of like, ratcheted up when you're in the inside. So the knowledge of these rules and the way these rules apply and the way they kind of are there to transform individuals is remarkably what Foucault was working on in 73 with the punitive society, focusing so much on for instance, it's the text where you see the emergence of the panopticon, of the idea of the panopticon prison, and the way in which it was intended to provide for total surveillance, and the way that, right, this is the moment in his thought which would give birth later to Discipline and Punish in 1975, but the moment where we see this focus on those rules and rendering bodies docile in this way, which is so much in what you've seen and written about, Cori, and of course Adnan as well. So here's what I'd like to do. So first of all, I want to thank you both for this so far, and you're going to stay on because what we're going to do next is we're going to turn, and Daniele, let's see, there you are. Ciao. You're going to actually let's introduce. You're going to introduce everyone properly. The other participants properly. Maybe everyone can actually turn on their videos as you do this, and then we'll go into some reflections on the work, the Punitive Society, on the book, and then we'll try to bring this all together, right? The grounded and the theoretical work and the praxis. Okay, so Daniele.
Thank you. Thanks so much, also Cori, Adnan, Fonda, Lonnie. I mean, it was really helpful, as Bernard was saying, to I think ground our conversation, our critical work, and also our reading of Foucault in lived experience, in real practice. And I was struck with what Lonnie was saying at a certain point, about not knowing if there will be another lock on the door, and how many other locked doors there are out there in society, for previously incarcerated men and women. And I would say, which is probably the idea of the punitive society for everybody, really, like the idea that, in certain ways, we are in a society in which we have to deal with a lot of locks and locked doors, and we don't know where this ends. So I'm delighted to welcome and to introduce in alphabetical order our panelists from Warwick. Miguel de Beistegui has been a professor of philosophy at the University of Warwick for the past 25 years, and he has just taken up a research professorship at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. He specializes in 20th century German and French philosophy, and his most recent books include Immanence and Philosophy, Deleuze from 2010, Proust as Philosopher, The Art of Metaphor from 2012, and most recently, The Government of Desire, A Genealogy of the Liberal Subject from 2018. Henrique Carvalho is Associate Professor and Co-Director of the Criminal Justice Center at the Warwick School of Law, is a critical theorist of criminalization, punishment, and justice, and is the author of The Preventive Turn in Criminal Law from 2017. He is currently working on the project The Dangerous Essence of Criminal Law, funded by an early career fellowship from the Independent Social Research Foundation. Welcome. Stuart Elden is professor of political theory and geography at the University of Warwick. His work over the past decade or so has been in two main areas. On the one hand, the history, concept, and practice of territory, and on the other, the history of 20th century French thought. His most recent books include Shakespearean's Territories from 2018 and a monograph on the life and work of Canguilhem from 2019, And he also has recently completed the manuscript of a book entitled The Early Foucault, which will be published in June, and which continues the work in his earlier books, Foucault's Last Decade and Foucault, The Birth of Power. Goldie, Osuri, welcome, is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Director of the Social Theory Center at the University of Warwick. She works at the intersection of political sociology, critical social and cultural theory, critical race and whiteness studies, and media and cultural studies. Her current research is concerned with the complex ways in which colonial sovereignty continues to structure the activities of post-colonial nation states whilst they deploy an alibi of an anti-colonial history. She is the author of Religious Freedom in India, Sovereignty and Anti-Conversion from 2013. Irene Dalpoz completed her PhD in philosophy at the University of Warwick and Monash University, after which she was an early career fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study at the University of Warwick. She has published articles on ancient and contemporary philosophy with specific focus on the notion of the care of the self in the work of Foucault. And her current research is in political philosophy and citizenship studies. And she's now developing a project that questions whether now we can rethink the notion of citizenship in a more inclusive way. And last but not least, Federico Testa is Associate Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study at the University of Warwick. He obtained his PhD in philosophy at Warwick and Monash. And his current research focuses on 20th century French philosophy and the revival of the Hellenistic tradition in modern philosophy. He has recently published the English translation of Pierre Hadot's selected writings, and is currently working on a monograph on Foucault and Canguilhem titled On the Politics of the Living, while also developing a new research project on Canguilhem and politics. So welcome, everybody. Thanks again for being here with us. I will now just invite short comments from each of you following the order of the presentation. So Miguel, Henrique, Stuart, Goldie, Irene, and Federico. And we will then take some time for reactions and general conversation and Q&A. So Miguel, the floor is yours. You are muted. Yeah, good.
Sorry, thank you, Daniele, and thank you, Bernard. Because I have the honor of kicking off, I thought I'd start by trying to ask some basic questions and draw a few distinctions. In a recent speech, the French President Macron, in his desire to reform the French penal system, said that he wanted to bring an end to what he called the tout carcéral, the entirely carceral approach to the French penal system. And we can ask ourselves, would this mean the end of the punitive society as we know it? Can it be this easy? Now, rereading Foucault's lectures from 72, 73, as well as other related texts by him from that period for today's discussion, I kept asking myself, what could it mean to abolish the punitive society? And in light of this distinction, I was immediately struck by what I thought the distinctions that Foucault invites us to make. So let me just mention a few of them. First, I think we need to distinguish between the question of punishment, which has always existed, and the very specific phenomenon of what he calls the punitive society, by which he means a society of which punishment, a rationality and varied practice of punishment is an essential central mechanism. Second, I think we also need to distinguish between punishment and sentencing. The two can, of course, coincide, but need not necessarily coincide. Sentencing requires a legal procedure, but in the precise context of the punitive society and for historical reasons, one would need to clarify punishment requires an intimate and as complete knowledge as possible of what Foucault calls the dangerous individual or the dangerousness of individuals. that is to say of their habits, their motives, instincts, tendencies, patterns of behavior, etc. Now, dangerous individuals are constantly being punished, for example, through differentiated access to healthcare or insurance or credit, and through an increasingly elaborate system of credit scoring. Yet this danger is not criminal as such, or at least not always. The danger is not even actual. It is, I think, merely potential. Increasingly, the future is what determines the present, what's possible and not possible. Not the crime as such, but the dangerous profile is what matters. So today's punitive society is intimately bound up, I think, with the idea of risk and the possibility of accessing it, assessing it scientifically. A different kind of truth is at work here, one that establishes often biased profiles related to risk factors. Truth is no longer an event, but something like a statistical reality. Today's punitive society is also a risk-assessing society, statistical society, and one that privileges something like micro-disciplines and micro-adjustments over molar ones. Increasingly, the algorithmic model is replacing the human and social sciences in establishing the norm. Foucault would say in its ability to dire la norme. This in turn means that we need to raise the question of the prison within this, I think, expanded risk-driven rationality of punishment, which is also a rationality of reward. So how does the prison system continue to operate and even exist in this context and normative society? This is the point at which I think we would need to note the significant differences, and maybe we can talk about this later on, that exist between certain nations, such as the United States, on which we're focusing today, defined by mass incarceration and long-term sentences, and other more liberal and mostly Scandinavian societies which privilege short sentences and open prisons. How do we explain the fact that despite the indisputable evidence regarding the fact that incarceration does not work, it does not normalize, but it marginalizes? And as Foucault notes in the 1972-73 lecture course, was recognized as a failure from the start, as early as the 19th century. How is it that most Western nations remain so attached to it? One can point, of course, to a lack of imagination or a form of laziness. More convincingly, one can point to the collusion, I think, of neoliberal capitalism and the rationality of punishment. The privatization of prisons is a lucrative business, which affects also the treatment of migrants in the US especially. Finally, one can point to the mass incarceration as the perpetuation and extension of the systemic racism of slavery, colonialism, and anti-immigration attitudes that characterizes the history of the US and various European countries. So to conclude, I'd say that there is evidence that in a way we have already moved beyond the punitive society as focused solely on the tactic of imprisonment or enfermement, as Foucault calls it, and towards a society of more efficient control and surveillance. At the same time, we can't ignore the differences between neoliberal and or systemically racist societies, which continue to incarcerate and incarcerate more, despite the evidence of failure of such methods, and more liberal social democratic societies, which incarcerate less and are increasingly turning to short sentences and open prisons as forms of rehabilitation. Let me end this brief presentations by asking the following question. Is the challenge today that of abolishing the punitive society, or more broadly and more fundamentally perhaps, of abolishing normative power, that is to say, the normativity of power, of which the prison system is a manifestation, and overcoming the different regimes of truth with which that system coincides? Okay, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Miguel. It was so helpful to start with these distinctions and with this way of framing the discussion and with these questions. And while we were talking, I was thinking of the fact that Foucault starts, working on what he will later call disciplinary and biopolitical society by using the term punitive society. And then there's a kind of shift in his work. And so it seems that you are in a way describing something that is happening also in Foucault's work. It starts by focusing on the prison and on punitive society itself, but then in Discipline and Punish and in later writings, he always talks more about a disciplinary and a punitive and a biopolitical society where precisely the focus would be a bit broader, right?
Yeah. Normative power, I think, is his focus. Yeah, in that period, 75, 80. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that Henrique will also have, some comments that kind of prolong some of these ideas. So why don't you unmute yourself, Henrique? Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, and thank you very much for having me here. Thank you for organizing this great seminar. And well, to keep it short, I'll try to stick to the text as much as possible. Otherwise, I may just run ridiculously out of time. So my reflections here will focus on one aspect of the punitive society that I believe needs to be particularly emphasized and investigated, especially today. The punitive society is not simply the society that punishes. It is a society that is punitive. So this idea of being punitive is what I want to focus on. And in my view, it's about more than simply delivering punishment. It is about reproducing punitive logics that are or have become inherent to social order and therefore to the ways in which society is imagined and experienced by its members, which in turn inevitably has an important emotional and affective dimension that carries significant consequences to people's sense of identity and belonging. It is my contention that to think and move beyond the punitive society, we must first confront in a deep and serious engagement what being punitive means. I want to just briefly raise what I consider some of the most critical insights from these lectures by Foucault, which I believe are still very relevant today. The first is how the predominance and pervasiveness of penalty, its acceptance and sense of validity, are a puzzle. There is nothing obvious or rational to it, to punishment. Prison doesn't work and has never worked, at least not in the ways in which it has been deemed to work or the purposes which are used to justify it. Instead, prison's function, as highlighted by Foucault, lies rather in its production of delinquency, of criminality. This productive quality is, as Foucault suggested, a not insignificant component in the exercise of power on bodies, an element of that physics of power that gave rise to the psychology of the subject. What must be highlighted is that this production of criminality contributes not only to the psychology of the punishable subject, but also and primarily, in my view, to that of the punitive subject. This, more than anything, allows us to reflect on the important symbolic and affective dimension of punishment. Why, despite its failures, its violence, its ugliness, punishment is regarded as justified, as something that the society should seek and something that we need. In a long-standing collaborative work with Anastasia Chamberlain, a colleague from Warwick, we have been investigating how the urge to punish is a constitutive aspect of modern identity, and how it relates to the ambivalences that lie within modern and especially liberal social orders and imaginaries. penality doesn't merely reproduce a specific social order and its correlated dynamics of power. It enables them by making them appear not only necessary, but also morally righteous and socially beneficial. The sense of utility given to punishment and its many institutions shouldn't simply be dismissed as a mask to conceal its true function. It should rather be seen as one of the main elements, if not the main element of its dysfunction. Here, we should consider another of Foucault's pivotal insights in the punitive society: how the specific form of modern punishment, confinement, has been historically linked, even before its full penal incorporation, to the management of disorder. We should, however, realize how this relationship is multifaceted and how its real power lies in its essentially ambivalent character. Punishment both affirms disorder by promoting images of criminality and dangerousness and providing a medium for their material reproduction, essentially generating criminality as something inherent to modern society, which needs to be permanently managed. So it affirms disorder, and at the same time, it also negates this disorder, or rather displaces it, by symbolically asserting that such disorder does not originate from society's structural inequalities and power imbalances, but rather from the actions and behavior of dangerous criminals. In so doing, punitive logics not only maintain and reinforce a specific social order, but they also reassure it by symbolically purifying it from its own disorder by means of the scapegoating ritual of punitiveness. Through this symbolic work, punishing appears as something not only necessary, but something useful, something desirable. Even when the failures of punishment come to the fore, punitive logic suggests that the solution is never beyond punishment, but only to punish better or to punish more, Foucault would say. This reassuring function of punitiveness is something that fulfills an important affective need inherent to punitive societies, which imbues punitive practices and institutions with significant allure, and which allow punitive logics to also go well beyond the penal realm, as Miguel suggested, although you can find punitive logics everywhere in a punitive society, in welfare, education, health, and migration, it goes on and on. To move beyond the punitive society, then, we must first go back to Foucault's initial question and face head-on the puzzle of punishment, I suggest. Moreover, in doing so, we need to be prepared to ask uncomfortable questions about what the problem of punishment means to our societies and us. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Henrique. That was beautiful, important to really focus on. I mean, I guess that it's an aspect that remains a bit implicit in Foucault's account, this aspect of the reassuring function. But I think that it is there, you know, like if you really read between the lines, and when you were talking about morality and also kind of the link that there is with a certain kind of moralizing function as well, I was reminded of this line in the punitive society that I always found very interesting, where Foucault says that morality doesn't exist in people's head. It's inscribed in relations of power. And so, you know, like morality itself and what we consider moral and the moralizing function, etc., is itself a product of a certain way of organizing social and power relations. And that's crucial as well, I think.
The passage you were referring to, for everyone, you were telling me about earlier, is on page 113 of the English edition. So at the bottom of 113, and I think it's something, you're entirely right, Daniele, that I think we want to come back to, right? The conclusion to be drawn, he writes, from this is that morality does not exist in people's heads. It is inscribed in power relations. And then I think what you're pointing to is the next part, which is most important, right? And only the modification of these power relations can bring about the modification of morality. So something we'll definitely want to come back to. Yeah.
Great. Stuart, the floor is yours. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Daniele. Thank you, Bernard, for the invitation. And in my contribution, I focus on a single word, the word dynastic or dynastics. And it's a word I think only appears once in the Punitive Society, but I think is still significant. So really my comment is on how Foucault works in this course, rather than just on what he works on. So in the early 1970s, Foucault is seemingly undecided about what to call his supplementary or complementary approach to archaeology. And looking backwards, it seems obvious that the term that Foucault is using is genealogy. And genealogy is a term that, in name at least, is indebted to Nietzsche. But what I'm trying to suggest in this contribution is that this isn't fixed in Foucault's mind until the mid-1970s, so after this course. Genealogy is mentioned in the Order of Discourse, Foucault's inaugural lecture at the Collège de France in December 1970, when he contrasts critical analyses and genealogical ones. Now, Foucault has lectured on Nietzsche and genealogy before this, but he'd not used this to describe his own work, except for a sort of throwaway comment in a 1967 interview, when he says that my archaeology owes more to Nietzschean genealogy than to structuralism properly so called. And in the early 1970s, when Foucault talks about genealogy, it's generally as an object of study rather than as an approach to it. So in his first course at the Collège de France, Lectures on the Will to Know, he talks quite a lot about genealogy, but this is actually in terms of the lineage of kings, of ancestors and heroes, so a traditional sense of the word. It's around this time that Foucault writes the Nietzsche genealogy history essay, which appears in a volume of tributes to Jean Hippolyte in 1971. And this is an essay that Foucault draws on his earlier teaching, particularly at Vincennes in 1969-1970. But in that essay, I think it's very much at this point still a description of what Nietzsche is doing, and that Foucault is not yet claiming that this is his own approach. But from 1974, and it comes through in the psychiatric power course, Foucault does use genealogy explicitly to describe his own work. And that continues through into some of the introductory comments in Discipline and Punish, and then particularly how he describes the history of sexuality. Now, the term dynastic, though, has a slightly different history in Foucault. To my knowledge, the first use of the term dynastic is in December 1971 in the Penal Theories and Institutions course, so the second course at the Collège de France, the one immediately before the Punitive Society. Foucault suggests that we must analyze revolt and suppression not through a semiotics of the elements, but in a dynastic of forces. And then in the closing lecture of that course, Foucault suggests three levels of analysis: the history of sciences, the archaeology of knowledge, and knowledge power. And to approach the latter, he says we have a dynastic of knowledge. So we've got a dynastic of knowledge and a dynastic of forces as this new way of exploring. Now, Bernard, of course, was the editor of the Penal Theories, Institutions and Punitive Society course, and the most substantial discussions of what Foucault means by the term dynastics can be found in his notes and the notes that Claude-Olivier Lorrain added to the Penal Theories and Institutions course. And they give all of the textual indications where Foucault talks about this term, both in these courses, but also in an important 1972 interview that Foucault gave in Japan, but which hasn't been translated into English. Now, the dynastic term then is used in the Punitive Society. This is the instance in this course, and I'll just read a passage from it, 31st of January, 1973. The problem, Foucault says, is precisely to find this apparatus of power and to see how the prison form could effectively be inserted and become an instrument in power relations. Sorry, this is page 83 to 84 in the English translation, page 86 in the French. So the problem, I'll start again. The problem is precisely to find this apparatus of power and to see how the prison form could effectively be inserted and become an instrument in power relations. Until now, we have been studying the threads of possible derivations. For example, how within the theoretical and practical penal system, ideas and institutions join up with each other. Now it is a matter of finding the relations of power that make possible the historical emergence of something like the prison. After an archaeological type of analysis, it is a matter of undertaking a dynastic type of analysis, a genealogical type of analysis, focusing on filiations on the basis of power relations. So in this instance, in this course, the term is paired with genealogy. It's almost as if these terms are synonyms. But in the next lecture on the 7th of February, 1973, this is page 111 of the English, Foucault talks about the relation between two ensembles that he wants to analyze. On the one hand, a penal ensemble characterized by the prohibition and the sanction and law, and on the other, the punitive ensemble characterized by the coercive penitentiary system. As well as an archaeological approach to this, he says the genealogical problem is to know how these two ensembles of different origin came to be added together and function inside the same tactic. Here, Foucault is using archaeology and genealogy as the contrast. He does not mention the dynastic. And after 1973, when Foucault uses the term dynastic, he usually uses this to describe relations rather than as an approach to history. So in the psychiatric power course in 74, for example, he describes the traditional dynasty of schools, barracks, prisons, and so forth. There's some instances of the term dynasty or dynastics in the abnormals course in 75, and by Society Must Be Defended in 1976, Foucault uses the term in the much more traditional sense of lineages of royalty, the sort of standard definition of a dynasty or dynastics. Now, the timeline that I'm sketching here of these uses seems to me to be important because we read these courses in the light of the books and the other publications which actually came after them chronologically. But they were actually, because they were published long before these courses, we tend to read back into the courses things that are actually later in Foucault's published work. And if you add to that the way that the courses were published in a non-chronological order, I think what happens sometimes is that we think that something is there when it actually isn't explicitly stated. So in a sense, what I'm trying to do is to trace a kind of a genealogy of genealogy or a dynastics of these conceptual dynasties to try to think about how Foucault is using these terms and when he shifts emphasis. And that's really my one qualification to the notes that Bernard and Claude Olivier added to these two courses, is that I actually think there's only one instance when Foucault unambiguously equates the terms dynastics and genealogy. And that's this instance in the Punitive Society course. It's the first time that Foucault uses the genealogical and the dynastic in this kind of equivalent way, but it's also the last time. And that from that point on, Foucault is using genealogy as the description of the approach that he wants to add alongside his work on archaeology. So this course is a kind of a moment when Foucault is effectively kind of handing the baton from one to the other, from the dynastic to genealogy to stand for this approach. He then contrasts the archaeological and genealogical to this analysis of this confluence of the penal ensemble and the punitive ensemble. And then I think we're into familiar territory, archaeology and genealogy as Foucault's approaches. So in thinking about that relation, the penal and the punitive and their relation and how Foucault is trying to explore those, which is obviously the focus of our discussion, I just wanted to spend a moment to think about the way that we might examine them, the way that Foucault tries to examine them. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much, Stuart. It was really important, I think, and I know I see that there are some students at Warwick that, you know, last term took a class on genealogy. I'm sure that some of the things that you just said, you know, like kind of resonate with that. And I think it's a very important question when we read Foucault to actually try to understand what he's doing with the writing of, you know, the very peculiar way in which he writes history, or he seems to write history while also doing philosophy, while also doing critical work, and how the writing of the history of the prison, for instance, can be also read as a way for him to do philosophy and to do critical theory. So that's actually crucial. So thanks for introducing us to this question as well. Okay, next, Goldie, welcome, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Daniele, and thank you to Daniele, Bernard, and Fonda for organizing this. I'm really pleased to be here and to hear all these brilliant insights from everyone. So I guess when I was thinking about what to write and thinking punitive society and trying to brush up a little bit and go back and read some Foucault, I was thinking about my own research at the moment in the context of the Indian settler colonial occupation of Kashmir and the word that keeps coming up all the time, every day, is impunity. And I think I should write about that. So in thinking about Foucault's lectures and the punitive society and the productive function of the state in producing and managing the legal and the illegal, I think we need to think about how we live in societies marked by colonial impunity, that colonialisms haven't been held into account in the past and in the present. And I was actually quite struck by, I think it was Rashan Thomas's blog post that has been, I think was posted for this seminar, where he says, and he's talking about state penal systems and how they want to make you accountable, but they don't acknowledge their role. And the quote is, "The powers that be do not take accountability for their role in creating and continuing cycles of violence." So, following on from that, I think we need to acknowledge how we live in societies marked by impunity, and how this impunity is actually made possible through an international system of nation states, their dense network of geopolitical alliances that enable, facilitate, and profit from the organization of punitive societies. And I think I'm referencing here, I think, W.E.B. Du Bois's emphasis on the organization of society, when he talks about it being marked by racial injustice. But we also, and he would have referenced this as well, we need to think about how this international system of nation states has been shaped by the processes of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. These processes were catastrophic, characterized by massacres, land dispossession, weaponized epidemics, resource extraction through plantation economies that trafficked in iron manacled slave labor, indentured labor, and of course the plantation economies that I'm speaking of are about rubber, wood, cotton, indigo, tobacco, tea, spices, and sugar. So that by the time Adam Smith wrote or published, The Wealth of Nations in 1776, the transatlantic slave trade was making the wealth of European nations and the elite for more than 240 years. And there is still no public or official acknowledgement of the manner in which these processes were and are a Holocaust. Catastrophes wreaked on millions of people around the world. And this is the foundation for the context of the societies that we live in now. There are debates, of course, in terms of decolonial thinking in relation to reparations and so on. But this question must be complicated by the coloniality of contemporary post-colonial states. And this is in relation to my research. I have argued that the coloniality of post-colonial states like India, for example, should be acknowledged for expanding an illegitimate sovereignty over peoples and regions that never ceded their sovereignty. So the story of Indian administered Kashmir, of course, is of denied sovereignty. And since 1947 and since August 2019, settler colonial political and legal structures have been formalized by the Indian state. Laws that have been enacted, like these are laws of that provide a kind of exception to the region of Kashmir. Laws like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, enacted in 1990, the Public Safety Act in 1978, continually provide an infrastructure of impunity. State sanction is needed for the prosecution for the state's indiscriminate violence. It is the state that continues to sanction extrajudicial killings, murders, rapes of men and women, torture, massacres, revolving door detentions. So you put someone in prison for 2 years, they come out, then you put them back in prison again. Enforced disappearances. I think there's more than 8 to 10,000 enforced disappearances, but hundreds and thousands of people have been killed, especially since the 1990s. Last week, 3 young men were picked up and killed, and their bodies were not returned to their families. Their bodies were buried far away. There was the army said that they were militants, but of course they were not. The families contest that. But there has not been any kind of there has not been a conviction for the last 3 decades. So impunity reigns. The Jammu and Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, these are organizations, human rights organizations that have been documenting these atrocities for the last 3 decades. In October, I spoke of the annexation in August 2019. This October, I'm sorry, not this October, this was last year, October 2020, the offices and homes of human rights defenders were raided under an allegation of terrorism. And the allegation is basically spells out that any hatred, contempt, or disaffection toward the government of India would be considered terrorism. So any documentation of human rights is considered terrorism by the Indian state. So no room is given to breathe, let alone dissent or speak. I recall here the words of Frantz Fanon, "We revolt because we can't breathe." These words, as Nigel Gibson points out, resonate with George Floyd's last words in 2020, "I can't breathe," and the longer abolitionist movement against state-sanctioned violence. Uzma Falak, a Kashmiri poet and scholar, pays tribute to the resistant spirit of last words spoken by Kashmir's freedom fighters in her poem, Last Words Spoken, Speaking, Speak, in spite of, regardless, despite everything. For Kashmiris, silence is not an option. Words and images are explosive forms of revolt. These words by Fanon, Floyd, and Falak form a chain of links between struggles countering coloniality across time, across space. Countering punitive societies through calls for abolition requires a radical transformation of society and political economy, says Ruth Gilmore Wilson. A radical transformation involves countering a network of militarized, carceral, international nation states shaped by coloniality, as Angela Davis argues. So we are living in a time where we are witness to a spectrum of protest movements and sovereignty struggles that link these contexts. The call for accountability, justice, and freedom is also the process by which coloniality can be named and impugned. These calls may take liberal as well as critical activist forms through normative legal processes or through critique. And sometimes we forget that both of these things are simultaneous forms of activisms, whether it's online, through street activisms, through those legal processes, which we know are fraught with the logic of the state, but we do them nonetheless. So to listen to Foucault's call to conceptualize a society where power has no need for illegalities, we need to join this chorus that impugns the coloniality of impugned societies. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Goldie. Really, that's it's so important to add that dimension, which in large part is missing from this text. The treatments in relation to slavery are much more in relation to Beccaria and kind of some of the Enlightenment European thinking about slavery and torture in that context. But you're entirely right that, it's really important. A missing dimension is the way in which this punitive society, as it is being born, is related to the colonial enterprise. And I think that really helps us. Your intervention really helps us to see that dimension more, to think about it, and also then to think about it in its current contexts today as well. So thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, if I can add something also on the element of speaking and silence, this was a crucial element of, I would say, Foucault's activist work at the time with the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, the prison information group, which was precisely aimed at giving a voice, giving a platform for inmates to be heard, and this kind of tension between speaking and remaining silent, and the importance and the urge and the necessity to speak is is something that I think is crucial, both in the punitive society and in dealing with what you were saying, with the past of our punitive society, which is still very much present and which still bears so much so many consequences in our present. So thank you so much for this. Irene, oh, I see you. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Daniele, Bernard, and Fonda for organizing this event. So in the opening of the 7th of March, 1973 lecture, Foucault argues that we can see a division of the punitive society into two classes, one composed of, I'm quoting, the bearers of virtues, of the values of the good, and the other characterized by the vices driving it, by its immorality, and by the fact that it was considered to be foreign to the very body of society, end of quote. So I like to use this quote as a point of departure from this short presentation inspired by Foucault's work, and perhaps for a broader reflection about the morality of the punitive society and what I call the working hypothesis. Namely, reimagine and perhaps moving beyond the dualism between the criminal as a social enemy and the good or virtuous or responsible citizen. As is known, the criminal as a social enemy and the good citizen are produced and regulated by the same political economy of illegality, the same political rationality permeating the entire social body through different strategies and means. This moralization is implemented by the state, which, as Foucault points out in the punitive society, has become an agent of morality, called to train, control, supervise, and correct the behaviors and the habits of the population through social laws. Social laws, though, far from being neutral or objective, as Foucault points out, are an instrument by which a social class can control the members of another, or if you want to follow the war metaphor, can conduct a war against the members of another class. And it talks about the working class in the punitive society. So who are the criminals as social enemy and the good citizens? Criminals as social enemies are those individuals, according to Foucault, whose actions, by breaking the social contract, represent an attack on the social body and its guiding economic imperative. They're not productive, or perhaps they're not productive enough. In virtue of their social dangerousness, criminals have to be rehabilitated or socially reintegrated. So while the actions of criminals against social enemies are subject to legal sanctions and moral reproach, individuals complying with those norms and laws made by one class become the virtuous or responsible citizen, whose life, if you want to use biopolitical terms, whose life should be protected and whose actions are exemplary. But of course, the question is, why should we apply this denaturalization of the juridical system and the moralization of the state also to the notion of citizenship? Because, of course, this research has been done extensively about criminality. Well, first, because by doing so, for example, we can redirect our attention from the fiction of an abstract and universal subject of rights, which has correctly often been overlooked by scholars recently because considered empty, outdated, if not obsolete. An empty, outdated political category. So from this abstract subject of rights to a heavily politicized notion of the good and responsible citizen, and to the modalities of its production. In this way, I suggest that with this change of perspective, we can question how the good and virtuous citizen is produced and regulated. Again, we have studied the modalities of production of criminality, the epistemologies, the system of knowledge supporting institutions and practices. But can we do the same with the good citizen? Are the same institutions, are the same practices? Now, to mention that an analysis of how the notion of the good and virtuous citizen operates alongside the notion of the criminal as social enemy would allow us to interpret some contemporary phenomena like privilege migration, citizenship revocation, or some security measures, thinking of the lockdown measures recently implemented by some states. All these phenomena that a traditional legal framework fails to explain. And above all, to conclude, it seems to me that if we want to transform or to reimagine our society beyond the punitive society and its structural injustice, So if we want to abolish an unjust society, it seems to me that we also need to abolish this dualism, again, the criminal and the good citizen. And we need to rethink the subtle category of the virtuous and responsible citizen. Subtle precisely because by moralizing them, it masks and reinforces some socioeconomic inequalities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irene. That was really important, I think, to push us to reflect on this dualism and the idea that the image and the figure and of the criminal subject is constituted with this other kind of idealized, but at the same time also concretely produced, a figure of the good citizen, and this helps us to, I think, underscore the productive aspect of power in Foucault's analysis, and productive especially of certain forms, certain kinds of subjects, and also maybe that could be something that we could discuss later, the element of individual responsibility. I mean, when we talk about moralization, there's a certain insistence on, the good citizen is someone who is, individually responsible for it, especially now, during lockdowns, etc. We have this rationality that is very present. And at the same time, individual responsibility is put onto, like individuals who are incarcerated, and there's this discourse of a certain moralization and individual way of dealing with this that I think Foucault can help us problematize a bit and see also some of the blind spots for that. Okay, so last but not least, Federico, welcome and thanks for being here.
Thanks for the honor of being the last to speak. Also, the difficulty of saying something different and new with regards to what they said before me. Thanks to all the previous panelists. Thanks, Fonda, for the organizing work behind the scenes. Thanks, Daniele and Bernard, for the invitation. Also like to congratulate Bernard for organizing the seminar, which is very exciting and very necessary. In this 5 minutes I have, I'd like to just make a few remarks about what I see as Foucault's analysis of capitalism in the lectures on the punitive society. I believe that this reading, this understanding of capitalism plays an essential role in Foucault's reflection on the form of punishment, on a coercive element that goes beyond the judicial or juridical penalty. So explain somehow the penalization of existence that begins in the 19th century. So roughly speaking, I believe that Foucault's reading of capitalism appears here as structured along two main axes, namely the axis of materiality and the axis of temporality. So, and they're connected to the forms of illegalism that he will develop later. So the axis of materiality emphasizes what Foucault calls a physics of power. The physics of power, the focus on mechanics of the body or the bodies, and which takes place in the encounter or the co-presence between the worker's body on the one hand and the body of wealth on the other. So in lectures 10, 11, and 12 in particular, this body of the worker is defined by its desires, its needs, and its pleasures. All those things expressing what Foucault is calling or calls an explosive energy of the body in this course. But this body is also defined by a physical force, which is potential for production, which is a virtual or potential labor power. And I say potential here because Foucault says, I quote, differently from certain famous post-Hegelians, he does not believe that labor is man's concrete existence. Human life, he argues, must be synthesized into labor power, and the body must be made productive by a system of coercion. So this is for the body of the worker. The body of wealth, on the other hand, consists in the spatialized form of accumulated bourgeois wealth and property. Not only the products or the materials of production, but the body of the productive apparatus itself, the assets, the machinery, the fixed capital of the means of production. So on the one hand, the body of the worker, on the other, the body of wealth. Foucault's analysis of the materiality of capitalism focuses then on the interaction between these bodies, examining how power will seek to apply and fix the worker's body to the productive apparatus, to the body of the productive apparatus, while at the same time preventing the dispossessed worker from attacking the body of bourgeois wealth. After all, Foucault explains, in industrial capitalism, everything is within the worker's reach, but nothing belongs to him. And that creates a constant danger for bourgeois property, the danger of the popular or lower class illegalism that he calls depredation, the attack on wealth. This leads us to the second axis that I would like to briefly sketch here, the axis of temporality. This is an analysis of how the time of people's existence, the time of life, which is marked by non-utilitarian processes, and Foucault mentions revelry, festivity, discontinuity, chance, violence, etc., is turned into labor power and integrated into the temporality of production. It's what I would like to call the regimes of time, the techniques for controlling people's use of and existence in time. And it's precisely this regime of time that will pave the way to the control of bodies. So in the punitive society, the control of the body and the history of the controls of the body that Foucault proposes to write appears as a sort of an ancillary control which cooperates or operates in conjunction with the control of time, which is done precisely through the modern institutions of sequestration. In this sense, then, if feudal production presupposed a power that localized individuals in space, a territorial form of domination, industrial capitalism fixes the working class in space by fixing it in time. The management and organization of the worker's life is essentially done through the control of time. So alongside what we could call a political economy of the body, as he will call in Discipline and Punish, in the punitive society, we find what we could call a political economy of time. However, if the power exercised over and through time opens a new field of operation, much deeper, much more discrete and constant than the sort of localizing powers that came before, Foucault also signals a new form of illegalism, interacting and resisting to this form of power. In what appears in the manuscript as a short history of laziness, Foucault speaks about dissipation, an illegalism that undermines capitalist production, not by attacking the physical body of the wealth, as depredation did, but by undermining the use of the body and time as labor power, a conduct, a way of living, we could say, that consists of or sort of subscribes to a refusal of industrious labor. So those are the two main axes. Just to conclude, one could object to this, that Foucault's analysis is, after all, just an analysis of the new forms of power over time and over the body, rather than a reading of the capitalist mode of production, we could say. However, in one of the lectures, in the 28th of March, 73, Foucault says that powers is one of the constitutive elements of the mode of production. That is to say, it is not the mere political repercussion or the reflex or that which sort of comes after the mode of production and reproduces it or assures its maintenance, but it is, this form of power, a part of the very structure of the mode of production. It is a sort of immanent and transitive cause, which means that power is not constitutive of the mode of production only in this genetic way, but also it is constitutive as a constant and defining attribute of the mode of production. This is why Foucault says, and I quote, Dismantling or not dismantling a type of power is essential to the very existence of the mode of production. End of quote. And here perhaps we could find maybe a case for abolition, or at least a clue of how to think about this. As long as there is an institution of sequestration and a type of power that affects sequestration, there will be capitalism. And as long as there's capitalism, there will be sequestration. So I'll stop here, and I'll prefer to discuss that last sentence with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. That was really important to kind of link our discussion as well to capitalism, mode of production, also kind of pointing to the very rich conversation, mostly implicit conversation that is going on in these lectures with Marx, the Marxist tradition, of course, and the kind of, critical stance that Foucault takes on some of the crucial points from Marx, like, for instance, Foucault would say mostly from the Marxist tradition, actually, with this idea that power is not a superstructure, right, but is itself constitutive of the mode of production itself, and with this idea that labor does not constitute the essence of the human being, right? But it's something that has to be made, the essence of what we are. So that was really rich and important. And Bernard, do you want to jump in?
I want to pose a question to everyone in a way, but before I do, Daniele, I want to give you an opportunity to if you want, or I can pose my question. But
I think we can just start. I said many things, so. So
so in listening to this has been a rich conversation that builds on so many different dimensions of these lectures and of Foucault's work on the punitive society, from the dimensions of, framing it within this notion of the normative dimension, as Miguel did, raising these questions of genealogy and the genealogy of genealogy, as Stuart did, and framing it within the question of colonialism as well, as Goldie did, raising the question of the social enemy, as Irene did, and of course the larger question of political economy, as Federico did. All of this it makes me wonder if there is a possibility, if there is a possibility to imagine a space outside of this large multidimensional normative dimension that we started with Miguel. In other words, this is and this goes in part to the praxis question that Daniele, you introduced when you were talking about that passage on page 113 at the bottom, right? Only the modification of these power relations can bring about the modification of morality, And of course, that notion, the modification of morality, is the modification of all of the dimensions you were talking about, right? Because it's not just morality, but it's a modification of the political economy. It's getting rid of the social enemy, etc. But only the modification of these power relations can bring about the modification of morality. Is it possible to imagine a favorable moralizing, right? Is it possible to imagine, and is it possible to imagine something that is not just the non-punitive, but non-punishment, right? And which is where we started in a sense, in Miguel's post as well, right? Are we talking about getting rid of a punitive society that has punishment, or are we thinking about getting rid of punishment? So the more radical step of and it becomes questionable whether it's possible. What does and in part, just very quickly, I mean, one of the challenges here is trying to think or imagine of a genealogy of a favorable practice. We don't have much of that with the genealogies that we have from Foucault. These are used in ways to do critical analyses of the present, but we don't really have, and I've been searching for, maybe this is a question to everyone here, since you're all such experts on this. Do we have a genealogy of an institution or of a practice or of a normative dimension that in some way we would be favorably disposed towards? You know, I mean, the only thing I can think of is something about the later work on truth-telling and parrhesia, which at times is just a history, but at other times seems to lean towards a more favorable appreciation of that. But so the question really is, having the full appreciation, as you all have helped us see, of the multidimensional ways in which these problems of the punitive society interrelate to colonialism, to capitalism, to the criminal as social enemy. Whether there's a way really beyond that, which of course was the idea of abolition democracy in Du Bois's sense of the term. And so where would be the threads, either in this lecture, really, or in other work of Foucault that would help us with that task, you know? I mean, that would be a question that I'd really like to throw out, because I think it's something we really want to grapple with. And I see Miguel's got his hand up, so why don't we start with you?
Just an element of answer to say that I think we do have at least an part of that genealogy, and it's one that you refer to in your own piece when you refer to Nietzsche's genealogy. And I have to say that I was fascinated by the many Nietzschean threads that were running implicitly or more or less implicitly through a number of the presentations that we heard, including, I think, Adnan's, who was referring so much to the affectivity, to the emotions, to the bodily investments that are present within the prison system. And of course, Foucault is at his most Nietzschean in those sort of early 1970s. And in that particular lecture course, it seems to me that he still has an eye on Nietzsche when he talks about genealogy, although he also has an eye, I think, as Federico was saying, on Marx. But I take your question, Bernard, to be, in the end, perhaps more of a Nietzschean question than a Foucauldian one, because indeed, when you address the question of punishment as such, I think you are situating it in a context that is broader than the way in which it is organized in the punitive society. So if we at least suppose that the punitive society is defined by a certain central organization of punishment and a diffusion of modalities of punishment throughout the social sphere and the different strata that Henrique was also talking about. We describe a certain kind of phenomena that can have a sort of its historical sort of lineage. But if you try to relate that to the possibility of exceeding punishment within a society, and I think you're dealing with a central Nietzschean question. And then you're dealing with, I think, a different conception of genealogy, because ultimately the Nietzschean question has to do with, in a way, the life of
larger issues of
the life of human affectivity, the life of the will to power, in the sense of a sort of a vitalist or of vital force, that is irreducibly bound up with the question of suffering, of human suffering. And the Nietzschean take, of course, is that what he calls the spirit of revenge, which leads to punishment as opposed to a more immediate response that would not belong in the sort of deferred, organized system of cruelty that he understands punishment to be, is a function of precisely the logic of what he calls ressentiment, which is creative, creates its norms, its values, including the norms of morality and justice that I think Foucault himself emphasizes. And again, I was struck by Adnan's reference to the moralizing that is constantly going on within the parole system and the cruelty. And I wanted to ask him about how strongly he felt about this connection between the moralizing aspect of the parole system and the cruelty of it. And that, I think, would be a very Nietzschean question, to try to see the way in which a certain form of justice and a certain form of morality is nothing but a disguised form of cruelty, far more cruel than.
Right. Let's actually let Adnan jump in, and then I've got Stuart, who definitely wants to jump in as well. But while this conversation is going on, I think Adnan, you want to jump in response to that? Or?
I do. Yes, I think just kind of thank you, Miguel, and also surmising what everyone has said. Different themes that came up were about punitiveness in the sense of controlling of its people. Why control? Capitalism. All those things obviously have a thread, and then you bring up genealogy. And Miguel, so the connection I constantly see with the dominant government and using morality to find its base or to preach to its base, especially in America with the Christian patriarchy, monotheistic patriarchy, that there's a God, a white God, distributed his powers to other white men, and then within those white men are within the institutions of government, policing, wherever, schools, and then those are filtered through the white patriarchy in white households, more locally. But taking a quick step back, when talking about the parole board, this idea I was bringing up earlier about conformity is also another topic brought up here was about impunity. So when you're sitting in the parole board, everything that you are being dissected, every moment of your life, your childhood, your incarceration is being dissected for the most part by these two ex-law enforcement people. And you cannot at all talk about the system. You cannot, quote unquote, blame the system for your failure. This idea, especially in America, this idea of individualism and this idea of lift yourself up by the bootstrap, it's all on you. If I go in there to the parole board and I say, however, but real quick, I want to say that you can mention that I grew up, I went through this traumatic experience, and then I behaved this way, I had these reactions, and then I did this. But you cannot say the school to prison pipeline was a problem for me. That was constantly punished in school. Or you can't say I was homeless. Or I was, because of homelessness systemically. I will share this too, that by the time I was 17, I was a parentless, homeless, high school dropout. But if I were to go to the parole board, I could only mention those things as taking accountability for what I've done, that these things happened to me. And as soon as I try to, quote unquote, blame America or the system, I will be denied. And so largely, that's the culture that we're in, of this conforming to our way so we can continue doing what we're doing. And one thing that I've learned, I'm finishing this quick little op-ed about, I'm very vocal on abolition, even reform, and activism. And I have been asked, I guess, that, hey, you did commit a crime. What about your sole accountability? Because I'm always either on social media, just system. And what I'm trying to describe in this piece is that my activism is my amends, right? I went from an 8-year-old Little League baseball player to an 18-year-old with a life sentence. And like I mentioned, by the time I was 17, I was a parentless, homeless, high school dropout, layers and layers of trauma. And the police showed up after I committed a crime. I had housing and food in prison, right? Not in society. And so once I learned, yes, I do take responsibility. There's court documentation, there's remorse. I today, sitting in front of you right now, have tons of guilt and shame and remorse within me for the crime that I've committed. But once I learned what happened to the 8-year-old me and the 18-year-old life sentence, what happened in those between time, what were some of the systemic factors, I realized that you can put me in front of a child that's mirroring my teenage days, that's going through something today, right now, as we speak. And I could give this child or this kid a pep talk, but this child will go right back into that substandard education, inadequate healthcare, over policing or policing in the community. So in order for me to make amends for the harm that I've caused, I can't give a child just a pep talk. I think it's important, but I can't just give a pep talk. I have to understand that I have to change things, at least individually, as much as I can, systemically. So as the parole board is asking me to be solely accountable for what I've done, America just refuses to accept its responsibility and its causative factors from slavery on. Like it just refuses, it just won't acknowledge it. And that is a totalitarian tactic, right? Unaccountable. You cannot be accountable. You see what Trump is doing now. You cannot be unaccountable. You cannot be accountable. It's a show of weakness.
Right, which is what what Goldie was talking about precisely, right? About impunity or the need for impunity. Cori, I see you're shaking your head, but let me get to you. Let's get to you, Stuart. You wanted to jump in on the Foucault, I think, on the question, and then Daniele, you also want to jump in, but and then let's bring in Cori right in there on that. Thanks, Adnan.
Thank you. I feel I'm taking this back a little bit from where we were, which was a very powerful set of comments from Adnan there. But I did want to pick up on this passage in the English translation on 113, Bernard, that you indicated about this question of morality and change. Because what's interesting about that passage, or at least one of the things that's interesting about that passage, is that it comes immediately after Foucault's talking about a very contemporary event in the course.
Yeah, right.
Which is about the French minister challenging the idea that the Doctors' Manifesto about abortion rights had happened during an election, and that the minister wants to push the abortion question into something about legislation, which he says, this isn't something that should be discussed during an election. And why I think that's interesting is because some people will know this, but I think it's an interesting factor in Foucault's kind of activism, is that alongside the prison information group that Daniele mentioned, Foucault's involved in this health information group, the Groupe Information Santé, and that one of their big campaigns is abortion rights at this time, but there's also a campaign for health rights for immigrant people in France, and also about industrial accidents and kind of health in the workplace. And all of those, I think, in a sense, a contrast in the activism to, say, the prison group, which is initially about making visible what's happening in prisons, giving voices to people that are incarcerated. The health group is a more, in a sense, active advocate for rights for people in different positions, whether it's about women's control of their own bodies, whether it's about the rights of the immigrants or the people working in industrial labor and so on. And the story of the Groupe Information Santé and the story of, say, the abortion rights struggle, to pick just this one example that's being referenced here, it does seem to me that you could tell that story, or that Foucault is trying to think about that story in this activism that he's involved in terms of a more positive history of a progressive extension of these rights to certain groups, rather than the more negative genealogies, which are maybe the main focus of the course. So I think there's something interesting in why Foucault is talking about morality and politics at that particular moment. Right. There's other things I might want to say about other questions, but maybe I'll leave it there for the moment.
Yeah. And it is a particularly interesting contemporary intervention, which they are rare, right? But you can kind of see the way in which, of course, they're rare in coming to the surface in the way it does here. They're throughout the text hidden. I mean, in other words, it's this silent conversation that's going on, but it's rare that it comes to the surface in this way. As I was rereading this passage, I was thinking about some of the debates yesterday on the Senate floor and on the House floor about the confirming the electoral votes, and these questions of what it is okay to say among kind of like in politics versus in law versus in morality, how some were arguing that no, this is the moment to actually debate the politics of the Pennsylvania vote, even though it was rejected in the court, right? And so the resonances I thought were pretty striking. Daniele, you wanted to jump in, and then I want to get back to Cori.
Thank you. Yeah, very briefly, just 3 points. First point in response to your question, Bernard, at the beginning, which I think is very important, and it's this, why can't we have a genealogy of solutions in Foucault? Right. But and I think that Foucault's answer to this question is because solutions are always local and historically specific to a given context and a given form that like a certain structure of power takes at every single moment. And so one of the
that's true of genealogy here.
It's true, but that's why I think that the closest you can kind of approach in Foucault this idea of it's not a genealogy of solutions, it's a genealogy of critique, and it's what it turns to from 1978 to the end of his life. Like his idea is writing a genealogy of different critical attitudes that of course will always take different forms, right? But there will be this kind of common thread of the will or the desire, and we go back to what Miguel was also saying, and a more Nietzschean aspect, I think, of Foucault, the will, the desire of govern oneself or be governed in a different way, or potentially not at all. To go back to, second point, to go back to what Miguel was saying, I was always struck by the concluding sentence of Foucault's lecture at Montreal in 1976 that we quoted in our introduction, in which he talks about, he says that the question that we should ask ourselves is, why is power so fond of illegality? Why there is this kind of fondness and kind of affective investment of relations of power and the kind of mechanisms of power in which we are for illegality, and I would say for punishing, and I would say for like having this structure of the punitive society as well. So I think that this more Nietzschean element, although it might not be at the forefront, I think we can pinpoint many different moments even after the beginning of the 70s in which Foucault kind of goes back to this. And very quickly, the third point in response to what Adnan was saying, that I think it was extremely important, like about the tension between individual responsibility and systemic injustice and systemic problems. There is a way in which Foucault comes to define at the end of his life freedom in terms of the field of possible actions. And I think that is crucial to actually kind of try to go beyond this kind of opposition of, either you're completely free or you are completely determined by external factors, right? I mean, if our freedom is nothing else than the field of the possible action that we have, it's very clear that the ways in which society defines that field of possible action probably doesn't determine up until the very details the actions that we will decide to make, but contributes in a very important way, to actually define what we are free and what it's possible for us to do. So I think that this is also a very crucial insight, and something that we probably need to reflect upon, the old definition of what freedom is really, and what individual freedom and individual responsibility is.
Yeah, thanks, Daniele. Before I go to you, Cori, though, to jump in and maybe continue the conversation with Adnan, just one footnote on this, right? Because I mean, the critical enterprise is always so good at seeing the dark side, which is part of the critical enterprise, the dark side of institutions, the dark side of practices, the dark side of economies, political economies and systems, etc. And you know. And so there's this bias in a sense, which creates the problem, I think, the unanswered problem that, only the modifications of these power relations can bring about the modification of morality in a positive way, I would say. We don't have enough, I think, and maybe this is, our responsibility now, but we don't have enough of acknowledged the positivity of things that are acknowledgedly failures, perhaps, so recognizing the dark side, but the genealogy that might be helpful in tracing something that one might be able to then model for others on how the modification, even in a very historical specific context, that could help us see forward in a way. And maybe that's our responsibility. Cori, sorry to keep you waiting. And of course, and boy, we gotta open it up to questions. So Cori, go ahead.
I'll be very quick. Yeah, I mean, I had this. Everyone has said things that sparked, my mind, and I have a million things I could say. But Adnan's theory of the religious aspect to this punitive thing and the eye for an eye, and I started thinking about, the solution question that you brought up, and I guess if there was a way to apply restorative justice, which is a system of, basically two sides sort of confronting each other and understanding, to all of these different systems that we've discussed here, if there was some way of applying that theory, that might be the way forward here. I mean, that was what came to my mind because I was trying to think of what would be a solution, what was a positive way of looking at this, and what could be a way of finding some healing and restructuring of this system. Because I mean, right now, basically a person is demonized forever if they've done something wrong. It's going to follow, that one wrong thing will follow them forever. The belief that a person is redeemable, can change, is not part of the system at the moment. And so that to me is what causes the need and desire to keep punishing someone forever, basically. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that was the one thing that came to my mind as a possible solution we could start thinking about.
Right. Yeah. Let me do this quickly because I mean, so we've got everybody. So let's officially go to the Q&A part of the seminar, and I have students who have questions. Please feel free to turn on your videos and raise your hands. There are also questions in the Q&A panel here, and also I'd like to ask anyone who's in the Q&A to get in touch with Fonda, and we can get your video going. Daniel, thanks for joining us. Naomi, thanks for joining us. How about Federico? Do you mind if we're going to take a few questions first? Maybe you can be one of the first to answer or something like that. But I know you have your hand up too. I'd like to hear from Naomi and Daniel immediately, and then maybe we can. How's that? Let's try that. Naomi, go ahead.
Hi, thanks everyone for amazing talks and the blog post beforehand, and thanks Bernard for organising this whole series, which I've enjoyed immensely, although somewhat rather exhaustedly when you were at the usual later time as I'm in the UK. My question really was about liberalism. I guess it's primarily a question for Miguel, but others might want to chip in. And Miguel, in your post and in your talk, you made a distinction between societies that were neoliberal and or systemically racist, and ones that were more liberal and social democratic. And I was wondering whether this might, in fact, exonerate or let liberalism off the hook too easily, and how you might account for an irreducibly illiberal tendency within liberalism. And I'm kind of thinking of the fact that, you know, if we think of Thatcherism as being a kind of entente between a neoliberal political economy and then a fairly authoritarian social conservatism, like that social conservatism and the kind of authoritarian law and order, security rhetoric and so on wasn't invented by Thatcher, wasn't a product or an effect of neoliberal generalizations of entrepreneurship and so on, but was something that has a long history going back to Britain's imperialist past, and not entirely dissimilarly in the States, a legacy of kind of wood settler colonialism and so on. And so I was wondering whether I'm by no means an expert on Scandinavian economies or political systems, but I wondered whether you might say a little bit more about whether you think liberalism is an antidote or whether it might be more appropriately described as a pharmacon for this kind of situation.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Naomi. I think I would, for the purpose of this particular point, scrap the term liberal and stick to the word social democratic. But at the same time, I would want to relate what you just said to the discussions we were having about the possible, well, that was triggered by Bernard, about the possible genealogy of solutions, of positive solutions, by saying that in a way we get the solutions that we deserve according to the problems that we pose. Now, depending on how we set up the problem, all sorts of solutions will become possible, and some of which might be implemented. In this instance, if we start with indeed very liberal views concerning individuality, I think the place of the individual within society, and even without going as far as Thatcher and denying the possibility of society itself and say that there are only individuals and families, but I think that the American situation is, at least of the right, is very close to that position. There is no such thing as society. There are only individuals and families and God and religion. And therefore, the question of crime and therefore the question of punishment is already triangulated in that way. Whereas it seems to me that in certain societies, and I've just looked very briefly, so I'm by no means an expert either, but in Scandinavia, and I looked at the Danish example in particular, it's quite remarkable that they seem to set up the problem quite differently and identify any form of crime from the start as a systemic problem, as a societal problem. And therefore, the approach is one indeed of rehabilitation, and one could still say normalization in a liberal sense, but which I think is quite markedly different from what we've just heard about through Adnan's film or through Adnan's own mouth. Right? So the rates of incarceration, I think in Denmark, are around 50 for 100,000. In France, in the UK, they're about double that, and in the States, there are 700. And then, so you see the different response to. Could we say the same problem? No, because I don't think the problem is set up in the same way in the first place. And if we look at rates of recidivism also, we see that they are incredibly low in those countries where no one, even in the most, I think for the most sort of violent crimes, spends more than 3 to 6 months in jail. So the sentences are themselves incredibly short. And then you have the open prisons, that you could say, individual responsibility is cultured, and so you have this kind of internalization of policing. But I don't know to the extent to which that is indeed the case. I think there is a different approach to the problem in the first place. So that's all I want.
And actually, and this might be a little bit provocative, but the language of solutions is a bit problematic for me right now. So it's got to be. So I'd want to gravitate to something else, but maybe part of the problem, at least in Foucault, if there is, that claim that there isn't a governmentality to socialism in a way, right? That infamous, or that kind of, that remarkable claim in, was it in Birth of Biopolitics, or in Birth of Biopolitics, right? With this, right? And in a way, that's kind of like, well, wait a minute. No, even if we aren't going in that direction, which obviously Foucault was not, we would tracing a finding a governmentality there would possibly be an interesting thing. Okay, anyway, that's just to kind of throw out a little.
Yeah, I'd say that I think there definitely is. The question is it a punitive one? You see, that's
right. Yeah. Daniel, Federico, Georgie. I see Sarah here too. Welcome. Daniel, do you want to jump in, and then Federico?
Sorry. Sure. Yeah, I just want to say thanks, Bernard and Daniele and everyone.
Sorry, Professor White.
Oh, thank you, Bernard. It's really wonderful to see you all in person, since it's been a while, some of you, and this conversation has been fantastic, and especially really moved by Adnan's contributions, especially. I think, and it's come up in another question, I think, by Samuel in the Q&A. The question I think that so many people are asking today, especially about this concept of impunity that Goldie so well brought up, is the question of the nature of impunity, insofar as that is something that's been displayed really clearly with the events at the US Capitol yesterday. And I think a lot of people, if you look online today, on the left and even the liberal left, are kind of a little confused about who do we want to give this kind of impunity to, right? Do we want to say that actually occupying buildings is a good tactic that people that we very much agree with have been able to do before? But what do we make of this particular occupation of the building, this particular kind of impunity? Where do we situate all this? I totally don't have an answer. I'm also, just as a second question, we can take either one. Bernard is asking about the question of the genealogy of solutions. This is a question I'm very much interested in myself, in terms of what I want to think of as a genealogy of the future. And this is something that's been, can be brought up in a number of different ways through historical, genealogical work on historical utopianism, or even science fiction and things like that. And one thing that I'm always kind of struggling with, and I think we've talked about this before, Bernard, is where do you find sort of these kinds of solution type things in Foucault, and how does genealogy fit into that? And I guess my question is, do we need to find that in Foucault, or do we need to figure out how to use the tools that have been given to kind of do that work ourselves, especially given what he says about his own role as an intellectual and so on? I do think, just to put this out there as a last thought, I think there's something very telling in Foucault's frequent use of the language of art when it comes to certain things, not just the art of living, the art of life and so on, but even in these sort of little concepts that never really get developed. I'm just blanking right now. It may be in the late 70s. There's a moment where he invokes this term of biopoetics, which he contrasts with biopolitics. And this is really promising, kind of gets dropped, but we see his impulse there to talk about something that we might think of in a positive sense, in a solution type sense. So you're talking about, it's always posed in the language of art, I think, or it's very frequently posed in the language of the arts. And I'm just curious where that might fit into the kinds of questions you're asking, Bernard. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. I see Goldie just there's a 2-finger on this, so why don't you go ahead, and then, yeah, go ahead.
But I just wanted to respond, I suppose, partly to Daniel, but partly to your question, Bernard, about, you're right about the word solutions. It's kind of a terrible word, I think. But it's also indicative of how we need to actually envision where we're going. I think maybe that's what perhaps that idea of solution brings up. And I think there's so much to think about. I think you're absolutely right. With each context, the question of accountability depends on, the people who want accountability and what they're asking for. But I think the larger issue for us to think about is, how did we get here in these, how did we get here? Why do we live in these kinds of societies? I mean, we live in a system of nation states, right? And I think there's something about the scale of the nation state which actually disallows that thing that I think Cori was talking about, the face-to-face, or the kind of more, the closer kind of relationships you might have if you lived in much smaller scale societies. I think there's something to that. I think we live in these large capitalist societies where you have an elite that actually profits from the punitive society and gets away, in these, there's an impunity to what you can get away with. The more power you have, the more clout you have, the more military might you have at the level of the nation state, the more impunity you have. So there's something to that. Like, I've been thinking about this idea of scale, especially in the context of climate change, especially, which is a whole different kind of conversation perhaps, but it is part of, what we're talking about here. How do we go forward? There is something about the destructive ways in which this large scale sort of society, it fosters a kind of destructive morality, if you want to use that word. Or so how do we live ethically? I mean, the only thing I can think of is degrowth and scale down, and you live in a smaller social context. There's more opportunity to live differently, perhaps. So I'll stop there. I mean, that sounds a bit grand, but I think,
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's right. Also, I think like lived experience and our own forms of practice and resistance, our own critical praxis, kind of in confrontation with the critical theoretic work is I think the way is one way forward. At least I'd like to hope. Otherwise, otherwise we've got even larger problems than the enormous problems that we have. Georgie, you have your hand up. Daniele just put something in the chat though that's worth saying out loud. So just say it out loud, Daniele, and then let's go to Georgie. And I hope I'm not missing people in the. Oh, Federico, where did you go? Oh, there you are. Okay, you got your hands up. So let's get Daniele, Federico, sorry, and then Georgie. Okay.
Hey, yeah, very very quickly. I mean, this is really out of my conversations with Sabina, who's working on a paper about this at the moment. In which basically the point is that Foucault, in Birth of Biopolitics, Foucault, in relation to the problem of the absence of a specific governmental rationality for socialism, at a certain point, he says that this is not a problem or a critique. It's just that this rationality, this kind of governmental rationality, has to be invented, and like the kind of, given the positive normative connotations that Foucault gives to this term of creation and invention in those years, I think that this is very telling. I mean, he's really saying, like there's a difference between neoliberalism, whose kind of governmental rationality is very well defined in a certain way and attached to the market, and the possibility that socialism that it doesn't define gives us to actually invent something, right? And I think that this is interesting, and really it's something that Sabina is working on right now. So it's I don't claim paternity for that.
Professor Bremner, you mean?
Yes.
All right, good. What did I say? I think it was Federico. I see Arabella has her hand up also. So Federico, Georgie, Arabella.
Thanks. Sorry, I'll be very quick. I just want to go back to that question regarding the possibility of a genealogy of favorable practices, not to say solution. And I think even though it's not formulated in terms of genealogy in the Punitive Society, in the 9th lecture, there's a whole idea of the stupidity of intellectuals. And basically, the idea that intellectuals somehow evade the discourses that are completely stated out there, right? So the discourses of power, the discourses of, in this case, still the sort of Marxist underlying vocabulary of this class that's dominating the other, so on and so forth. Well, I think in the same way that the discourse is stated and it has its effects, and Foucault mentions the possibility of dismantling the effects of this discourse. I think there's also, maybe I could call this with Daniele, a sort of genealogy of critical practices, or tension that points to these critical practices that also state their point. So there's also sort of counter discourses and counter conducts already there. And I think this is very clear in the prison information group or the health information group that Stuart mentioned. They're also discourses, and they're also stating their claims, right? And so it seems that favorable practices already exist out there. The intellectual should somehow overcome their blindness of these practices and sort of pay a particular kind of attention to them.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. That's a great point. First of all, though, I just want to give everyone out there the page for reference to what you're talking about, which is 164, 165. It's probably my favorite 2 pages of the whole lecture series. So for all the students who might be listening, definitely read that section. It's about the seriousness of these struggles. It's about the seriousness with which we need to take these struggles. And I could hardly, I'm always coming back to this, really. Particularly there was in the manuscript, he didn't, it was kind of, what was missing was this particular passage, sorry, in any event, about how serious you have to take these issues. And then the second thing is, of course, yes, right. I mean, so the praxis that he's engaged in right now, which is entirely related, both influenced by conflicting and influencing his theoretical work with the GIP, with the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, is precisely informed by all of the critical work that's going on, right? And so, not having a popular tribunal, but instead allowing the voices of the prisoners to be heard, etc. All of that work is completely, and so you're right. I mean, we can point to that. Yeah. Okay. Let me be quiet because we're running out of time. Georgie, and then Arabella.
Yes. Thank you for organizing this, for the opportunity to listen to these talks. I want to ask. I want to offer a possible answer to the question of positive conduct, or perhaps a positive ethics of resistance. Wouldn't it be useful to invoke Foucault's research on Stoicism and the Hellenistic period, the Greco-Roman ethics, the techniques of the self? Wouldn't Foucault say that these are the sort of the positive ethical dimensions of how we can offer resistance to the punitive society, etc.?
Yeah. So a lot of that later work, particularly about truth telling, particularly about paresia, has that dimension. I think that's entirely right. And those are genealogies as well. So yeah, thanks for putting your finger on that, Georgie. Arabella, you're going to close us out with the last question, I think. Although I want to ask Cori and Adnan to close us out with the last thoughts. Arabella.
Hi, thank you so much. This question is for Goldie, and I was struggling to put it in a neat, coherent package. But when you were talking about Kashmir, I was thinking about how like there is immense surveillance in this general like punitive society that's existing in Foucault seems to focus mostly on, as Federico said, like the body of the worker and the body of wealth. But I was also wondering about like the bodies of land and the bodies of water and resources that seem to be like really the source, or at least like one of the motivating factors in what's happening in Kashmir. And thinking about how there are people right now in forests who are trying to be, who are going to be evicted if they can't prove that they actually live there on the land. And that I wonder how we could fit that within Foucault, or if his theory needs to be like supplemented by something else, because he focuses a lot on kind of time and the body and the habits of the worker, but there also seems to be this other aspect that's particular to these colonial enterprises that he doesn't really acknowledge.
Great, Goldie, go ahead.
Thank you. That's a fantastic question, actually. I think, you know, I guess if one thing that if you want to reference Foucault, of course, you can talk about space and how, you know, Foucault, you know, spatializes, you know, what we think of. It's not just a focus on time. So he talks about body and geographies and so on. But I think we don't have to have everything from Foucault. So, I mean, he's not, you know, he's not the source of everything that we want or need. So, you know, I just recently wrote an article about this, about the idea of sovereignty and vulnerability and the interrelationship between them. And I think this is partly, I was engaging with Judith Butler's work on looking at the relationship of the body and to everything that is an infrastructure around us. And these include things like resources, water, land, everything. And you're absolutely right. This is exactly for the Indian state, and in other contexts too. It's not just the Indian state. It's the resources. They want Kashmir without Kashmiris, which is why they're more than happy to eliminate Kashmiris as much as possible. For them, the very small proportion of militants that are in Kashmir are an excuse to constantly engage in this kind of collective punishment and just keep killing people en masse. So if you think about those things, then I think one thing to think about in relation to that, again, that idea of going forward, which Bernard brought up, is to think about the ways in which we can reimagine our understandings of authority and sovereignty by thinking about the ways in which we are related to everything around us, right? Where we live, our localities, and how those localities are ecological, environmental, our relationship to land, our relationship to water. A lot of this stuff is being talked about by indigenous scholars everywhere around the world. You know, I'm thinking of Andrea Smith and others in the US context, for example, where they talk about sovereignty in these ways, that we must reimagine sovereignty in these ways. So I don't know if that's a response, Arabella, but I think those are some of my thoughts on that.
And there's, and also, Arabella, you can email each other too, I hope, and continue the conversation. We're running out of time. I realized, Sarah, I didn't get to your question. I'm sorry. Did you want to say something?
Yes, just a short question. I would like to come back to the point of how to go beyond the punitive society. Mm-hmm. And I would like to stress a more negative question. And I really like the formulation that Professor Lorenzini brought up, that Foucault is not writing a genealogy of solutions, but of a genealogy of critique. And my question is now, to what extent critique is not also embedded in the problematic side and not only leading to solutions. And to come back to the formulations of the punitive society, to what extent also the position of the critiker is embedded in the problem of conceiving society as an anthropological constant and not as a social form.
Mm-hmm.
Great, great question. I don't know, Daniele, if you want to give a quick thought on that. Very quick, very quick.
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, a quick thought. I don't know, but I guess that it is one of the things that one of the criticisms against Foucault, right? This idea that critique is internal to power and isn't able to actually tell us anything positive about what we should do or where we should go. In some of my recent work, I tried to frame the question a bit differently by trying to understand how, by writing the genealogy of critique, Foucault is trying to provide us with something more positive. Indeed, in the form, I would say, of at least a we or an open collectivity of those people who are actually suffering and subjugated by a certain mechanism of power. So I was trying to look at that direction to find a more positive way of framing what Foucault could also give us. But I agree with Goldie, right? We don't have to ask Foucault to provide everything for us there. Like I think that we should feel free to look elsewhere as well, and to be creative in our own work as well, and not remain too attached.
Now, I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to flame closing thoughts, but we're actually like 5 minutes over, and but it's okay because we're with Warwick. I think there's less of a dead. Although it's later for you, I think there's less of a kind of, in America, we kind of like stop it on the clock, but I'm hoping that, there'll be an indulgence with the, I don't know, different sense of time, maybe. Let's have just final words from Cori and Adnan, and then I think we'll close, just to close us off.
Yeah, I personally wish that Foucault was able to be here on this panel. I'd love to hear what he had to say about everything. But I just think that the most important thing regarding the justice system is to allow people with lived experience to be part of the solution and to sit at the table. I mean, if you had formerly incarcerated people sitting on parole panels, for instance, it would be a very different way of dealing with that situation. Have formerly incarcerated people who are part of peace issues and police and everything. I think that would be a way to have a different perspective and a way of looking at things from a lived and way. Anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's fascinating. Yes, that's right. That is right, and so important and so lacking. And one little footnote, and this goes back to Miguel's discussion of risk and algorithms. Actually, in the 1920s, when Ernest Burgess was starting his work on prediction tools and parole prediction tools, they also tried to have persons who were incarcerated, what used to be called inmates doing the risk assessment on their own. They would kind of like get the information themselves and then do a risk assessment themselves, which was, of course, from a very different perspective than what you're talking about, Cori. But there would be an interesting genealogy of that to try and flip it. Okay, thanks, because of how important that is, and actually how much that is perfectly in tune with the efforts of actually Foucault in the 1970s with the Jeep as well. Adnan.
I just want to say thank you.
You're going to close us
out.
I
don't know much of a closing. I'm honestly just want to really just say thank you to everybody that was here, that informed, educated, stimulated me. I'm very grateful for this discussion, whether it was a presentation or thoughts or even questions that I was reading in the Q&A. So I'm just very grateful. I think that what I'm leaving here with is I feel like the people that are incarcerated need this. Now it exists. I read Foucault while I was inside, but very hidden, and access to information is limited, especially access to this type of information in the institution is limited with intent. And so I'm just grateful. I don't want to go off into a tangent here. I'm grateful for everybody here. I just wish that my colleagues inside had a little bit more of this.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Columbia and other schools really have big efforts and work on justice and education. Colombia, through the Center for Justice and the Heyman Center, have an extraordinary center justice and education program that goes to prisons and to Rikers, and really, it is an effort to make this a conversation that we can all be part of, inside and out. And so it's one of the most important things, I think, and really valued here at Columbia and elsewhere. There are some other extraordinary programs. It's a tragedy what happened to education in prison. The fact that under Bill Clinton that they got rid of Pell Grants for persons incarcerated is something that one can only think of as being one of the most heinous aspects of our punitive society. And it's a tragedy that we have to remedy it through, volunteer, and that it's not actually made a part of the mission, which is to create a conversation, right? Okay, all right. This has been extraordinarily rich, and we have had, I really think we have had success in bringing together the groundedness of the punitive society and some of this critical thinking about it. And it's left me with a lot of directions to go in, I know. So I want to thank everyone, really, Irene and Goldie, Stuart, Adnan, Cori, Miguel, Daniele, Sarah, Federico, Georgie, everyone else who not here anymore, Henrique and others for this stimulating conversations. Please join us. The next session will be on January 21st, also a noontime session, the last one of the year, and we'll be focusing on the death penalty. Thank you, Daniele, for bringing and co-hosting and bringing all of Warwick with you. It's great to, you all have such an extraordinary team over there. It's really exciting. And so it's been great. Thank you, Daniele.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, everybody.
All right. And thank you, Fonda, for making this all possible.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Cheers. See you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.